A young police officer drifted on a log of ice, bound, bruised, and slipping toward the cold silence of death. And then a miracle appeared. A reclusive veteran in a worn green coat and his loyal German shepherd were walking the snowy bank when a desperate splash shattered the silence. What they discovered, and what that brave dog did next, became a story of courage, redemption, and the quiet miracles that still find their way to us. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and if stories of courage, justice, move your heart, please subscribe and share this story to help it reach someone who needs hope today. A pale winter haze drifted over the outskirts of Boise, Idaho, where the Boise River slid silently beneath drifting slabs of ice. The morning cold pressed against the earth like a heavy hand, flattening every sound except the brittle crackle of frost beneath worn boots. Ethan Walker moved along the snow-packed trail with the unhurried gait of a man who had long stopped expecting surprises from life. Ethan, 42, carried the look of someone carved by years rather than age. He stood tall, with broad, steady shoulders, his posture still echoing the discipline of the soldier he once was. His faded green coat, frayed at the cuffs, weathered at the seams, hung over his frame the way memories hung over his mind. Heavy, familiar, impossible to shrug off. A line of rough stubble traced his jaw, darker than his pale winter-burned skin, and his eyes, a muted gray blue, held the distant fog of someone who had stared too long at things he could never leave behind. War had not broken Ethan in loud, violent ways. It had hollowed him quietly, leaving a man who preferred silence because silence did not demand that he explain the ghosts that followed him. He had lost his closest friend during a nighttime rescue mission overseas, a memory that still struck like shrapnel whenever he heard sudden splashes or muffled cries. That grief had pushed him into the woods of Idaho, where people didn't ask questions and solitude felt safer than hope. His only companion now trotted beside him through the thin crust of morning snow. Max, a 7-year-old German shepherd, moved with the proud, deliberate steps of a retired working dog. His black and tan coat shimmered under the weak winter sun, thick and rugged enough to defy the biting cold. One ear had a small notch, a remnant of a training accident in his younger days, and his deep amber eyes carried a keen intelligence that seemed almost human. Max wasn't just a pet. He was the creature who dragged Ethan out of the bed when nightmares pinned him down, who nudged him outside when depression sank its claws in, who refused to let Ethan disappear into the silence he thought he deserved. They walked the riverbank every morning, tracing the same quiet path along the frozen water. It was routine, predictable, almost sacred. Ethan valued it because nothing unexpected ever happened here. Until this morning. Max halted so suddenly that snow sprayed from his paws. His muscles tightened beneath his thick winter coat, his tail freezing mid-swing. Ethan felt it immediately. Max never reacted this way unless something was deeply wrong. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured, though his body had already shifted naturally into an alert stance, old instincts tightening his breath. Max stepped toward the river, ears rigid, nose quivering with sharp, anxious energy. Then came a low growl, not aggressive but warning. Ethan followed Max's line of vision, squinting past the drifting sheets of ice. At first, he saw only the dull shimmer of sunlight on the river's surface, until something darker broke through the white. A shape, a color that did not belong to winter. Ethan's heart lurched. The object bumped weakly against a floating branch, turned slightly, and the truth froze him harder than the wind ever could. A human body was tied to a thick piece of driftwood, limp, half-submerged, swaying in the freezing current like a discarded rag doll. The ropes binding the figure stood out starkly against the pale water, tight, cutting, merciless. And even from a distance, Ethan could tell the person was small, slight, a woman, a young one. For a single suspended moment, his breath stopped. The icy air vanished, replaced by a memory. Another splash, another body drifting in dark water. Another moment when he had been 1 second too late. The guilt punched through him with blinding force. Not this time. Not again. Ethan shrugged off his coat with a sharp motion, barely feeling the sting of the cold as his boots pounded toward the riverbank. Max barked sharply, then leapt ahead of him, crashing into the frigid water with fearless precision. Ethan followed without hesitation. The river hit him like a wall of knives, cutting into his skin, seizing his breath, forcing his muscles to scream. But pain meant nothing now. Only distance. Only time. Only the fading hope that the woman might still be alive. Max swam in a straight, determined line, his powerful legs slicing through the current. Ethan fell into rhythm beside him, teeth clenched, jaw locked, pushing past the burn in his lungs. The drifting log spun slowly, revealing the woman's face, pale, bruised, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks, her eyes closed as if surrendering to the cold. Ethan reached her first, grabbing the frozen wood with numb fingers, pulling it toward him. Her wrists were bound so tightly the rope had bitten into the skin, turning it a swollen, angry purple. Her chest barely moved. "She's alive," he whispered, more a prayer than a statement. "Hold on. Don't you dare leave." Max circled behind them, barking in short, urgent bursts as if urging Ethan to hurry. The veteran slipped his knife from his boot and sawed through the icy rope, his hands trembling from cold and fear. When the last strand snapped, the woman slumped forward, her weight folding into his arms, soft, fragile, terrifyingly motionless. With Max guiding them, Ethan turned back toward shore, clinging to the woman with the fierce desperation of someone fighting his own past as much as the river. The current pushed, the cold bit deeper, but Ethan's grip did not falter. He had failed once. He would not fail again. And as they neared the snowy bank, his thoughts narrowed into one truth. Whatever nightmare this woman had escaped from, it had now become his to face. Ethan pushed through the last line of snow-laden pines, his muscles burning from the cold as he carried the unconscious woman against his chest. Her body felt far too light, trembling violently, despite his attempt to shield her with his own warmth. Max kept close beside him, the German shepherd's breath forming short bursts of fog as he paced anxiously, glancing between Ethan and the fragile figure in his arms. The cabin emerged through the drifting flakes, a small, single-story wooden shelter darkened with age. Its walls were made from cedar logs, so old they had turned silver under decades of storms. The porch sagged slightly, weighted by snow, and the lone window glowed faintly from embers still smoldering in the hearth inside. Ethan shouldered the door open and stepped into the dim interior, where warm air brushed against his frozen skin. The cabin smelled of pine sap, old paper, and the faint metallic scent of tools stacked neatly on shelves. He lowered the woman onto the worn leather couch with deliberate gentleness. Her face, bruised along the jawline, lashes clumped with ice, lips turning bluish, twitched faintly as her body struggled to reclaim heat. Ethan crouched beside her, his rough hands surprisingly steady as he checked her pulse, her breathing. The rope burns carved deep into her wrists. Those marks stirred something raw inside him, something that felt disturbingly close to rage. Max sat at her feet, vigilant, as though guarding an unseen line no threat was allowed to cross. A few minutes later, the woman's eyelids fluttered. Her breathing hitched as she tried to push herself upright. Ethan moved quickly but carefully, steadying her without crowding her. She blinked several times, her eyes a sharp hazel that cut through the haze like fractured light. She looked young, late 20s or early 30s, with a lean, athletic build that suggested constant movement, training, and discipline. Her dark brown hair, now tangled and stiff with frozen river water, reached her shoulders in heavy strands. Her skin was pale from cold, but beneath that pallor, she had the angular features of someone who rarely let fear dictate her actions. "Take it slow," Ethan said quietly. His voice was low, steady, a tone he hadn't used in years, a tone meant to calm panicked soldiers on battlefields. She swallowed hard, then spoke through chattering teeth. I'm Olivia Clark, Boise Police Department. Her voice cracked on the last word. She cleared her throat, gathered herself with visible effort, and tried again. I'm an environmental crimes investigator. Ethan nodded once, encouraging her to continue. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and handed her a mug of warm water infused with lemon and honey. Olivia's fingers shook as she held it, revealing the angry purple grooves around her wrists. Olivia exhaled shakily. I was assigned to investigate North River Chemical. They've been under suspicion for illegal dumping along the Boise River. She paused to steady her breath, her jaw clenching. But their owner, Richard Cole, he's powerful. Too powerful. Every report I filed vanished. Every photo I submitted got lost. People started avoiding me. The name Richard Cole meant something even to Ethan. He remembered hearing the townsfolk speak of a wealthy entrepreneur who had a polished smile and a shadow that stretched far beyond legal boundaries. Ethan didn't care for politics or corporate giants, but he knew men who built empires on cruelty. They all stood the same way, wore the same expensive coats, and smiled with the same practiced confidence. Olivia continued. Last night, I received an anonymous tip. Someone inside the company, I think. They said barrels were being moved at midnight. I went alone. She lowered her gaze. That was my mistake. A tremor crossed her face, not from the cold, but from the memory. Someone grabbed me from behind before I reached the creek. They tied me to that log, pushed me into the water. She swallowed, then whispered, They wanted the river to finish me. Max whined softly, pushing his head against her knee. Olivia blinked in surprise, then managed a weak, grateful smile. He's sweet. Ethan scoffed very lightly. Don't let that fool you. He thinks he's in charge. But there was no humor in his eyes. He was studying the bruises along her throat, the swelling on her cheek, the fear she tried so hard to bury. It reminded him too much of young soldiers he had once pulled from wreckage, brave on the outside, trembling behind the eyes. Why didn't you call for backup? Ethan asked. Olivia hesitated, then admitted in a low voice, I didn't know who I could trust. That hit Ethan harder than he expected. He understood the weight of isolation, the kind that made a person question every hand extended toward them. He handed her another small blanket, careful not to jostle her injuries. They thought I'd disappear, Olivia whispered, that no one would find me. Ethan tightened the bandage around her wrist, his jaw clenching. Outside the window, snow drifted across the world like falling ash. He stared at it with a solemn intensity. They were wrong, he said quietly. For the first time since Ethan found her, Olivia's eyes softened, not with relief, but with a fragile flicker of trust. And as Max lay between them like a silent guardian, Ethan understood something unsettling and unspoken. The war he tried to leave behind had simply changed shape. Now it wore suits instead of uniforms. Now the enemy poisoned rivers instead of fields. But the fight for people who couldn't stand alone, was the same. And this time, he wasn't walking away. Night settled heavily around the cabin, the kind of winter night that pressed its weight against the wooden walls and whispered through the cracks like a warning. Outside, the wind sliced through the pine forest in long, mournful sweeps, rattling loose icicles on the cabin roof. Inside, the hiss of the fireplace was the only sound, until Ethan unrolled a wide, creased map across the scarred wooden table. The table had belonged to the cabin's original ranger decades ago, and its surface bore knife marks, ring stains, and scorch spots, evidence of years of use and hardship. Tonight, it became something else. A battlefield. Ethan straightened, the lamplight casting sharp shadows along his angular features. He looked different from earlier. Not just a man trying to help a stranger, but someone quietly shifting back into the role he had once sworn he would abandon. Max lay near the door now, his black and tan coat illuminated by the fire's glow, his golden eyes fixed on Ethan and Olivia with unwavering attention. Every so often, his ears twitched at a gust of wind outside, but he never looked away from the two humans whose safety he had silently declared his responsibility. Olivia stood on the opposite side of the table. She had changed into one of Ethan's spare sweatshirts, dark gray and too large for her, the sleeves bunching at her wrists. Her damp hair now curled slightly as it dried, and though her face still carried shadows of exhaustion, her hazel eyes glinted with renewed clarity. The warmth of the cabin had returned some color to her cheeks, and the determined set of her jaw told Ethan she wasn't the kind of woman who lay down quietly after being hunted. She leaned over the map, pointing to a narrow bend in the Boise River, with fingers that still trembled slightly from cold and trauma. "This is where they stage the barrels," she said, tapping the spot. "The current slows here. They anchor the barrels under deadfall to avoid detection." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. His mind worked with mechanical precision, an old reflex from missions where maps could mean life or death. "And the dam?" he asked. Olivia circled a point upstream. "Old Riverside Dam. They use the maintenance platform as a loading point. No cameras, no patrols. They think no one pays attention to abandoned structures." Ethan's expression tightened. "Tonight?" Olivia breathed out slowly. "If they're consistent, yes." A firm knock struck the cabin door, startling Olivia but not Max, who had already risen and stood between the door and his humans. Ethan signaled for Max to stay, then opened the door. Cold air surged in, along with the presence of a man bundled in a thick brown sheriff's coat. Sheriff Mark Harris stepped inside hesitantly, brushing snow from his graying mustache. Harris was in his mid-50s, tall but slightly stooped, as if years of stress had bent him. His round face was soft, not weak, but weary, with pale blue eyes that suggested he wanted to do the right thing, but seldom felt strong enough to stand against the pressure of the wealthy and influential. He had a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when nervous, which he did now as he glanced at Olivia. "Lord above," Harris whispered, his voice trembling with both relief and guilt. "When you didn't check in this morning, I feared the worst." Olivia straightened, trying to hide the remaining tremor in her posture. "They tried to kill me, Sheriff. They tied me to a log and sent me downstream." Harris's eyes hardened, a rare steel showing beneath the gentle demeanor. "And Cole thinks he can own this county," he muttered bitterly. Behind him, two figures stepped into the light. Deputy Ben Foster came first, a thick-necked man in his late 30s with short-cropped sandy hair and a square jaw shadowed by a day's stubble. His shoulders were broad, his build imposing, but his gray eyes were surprisingly calm, carrying a quiet, unshakable loyalty. Ben rarely smiled, but when he did, it was honest. He had seen corruption ruin a partner years ago, and it left him with a permanent distrust of power. The second deputy was Laura Kim, about 29, slender but strong, with sharp cheekbones and sleek black hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore a plain black jacket over her uniform and had the poised alertness of someone who always anticipated danger 3 steps ahead. Laura's brown eyes flicked between Olivia and Ethan, assessing, analyzing. Her training from her previous department in Seattle had honed her instincts to razor precision. She had left the city because her warnings about internal corruption had been ignored, a betrayal that made her intolerance for injustice burn even brighter. Ethan gestured toward the table. "We need to move fast." The group gathered around the map. Ethan briefed them on Olivia's account, the barrels, the dumping site, and the timeline. Ben crossed his arms, his expression grim. So they're poisoning the river to save money. Laura's jaw tightened. People will get sick. Wildlife, too. It won't stop unless we catch them red-handed. Sheriff Harris shifted uncomfortably. I only trust 2 deputies in my entire department, and they're both in this room. He inhaled, straightening his posture. If Cole's men are active tonight, we'll be there. Olivia exhaled slowly. This is our only shot. Ethan felt Max press against his leg, steady and grounding. He looked at each person gathered around the table. A reclusive veteran who never wanted to fight again. A wounded officer who refused to be silenced. A sheriff who finally found courage. 2 deputies shaped by betrayal and duty. And a German shepherd ready to run through snow or fire if Ethan asked. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something warm pierce the cold iron around his heart. A sense of purpose. Maybe even fate. This is our winter squad, he murmured. Let's end this tonight. Snow fell so heavily, it blurred the line between sky and earth, turning the world around the old riverside dam into a shifting ghost of white. The moon, half-veiled behind drifting clouds, cast a pale silver glow across the frozen river, where pockets of icy mist hovered like the breath of some unseen creature. The cold pressed deep into bone, the kind that made every movement feel like it echoed in the stillness. Ethan Walker crouched behind a wide boulder coated in frost, his breath clouding the air as he scanned the clearing. His green coat blended with the darkness, and his rugged face, lined with worry and sharpened with resolve, looked exactly like that of a man who had stepped back into a war he thought he left behind. He rested one hand on Max's back. The German shepherd, muscles taut and ears pricked forward, tracked every shadow. Beside them, Ben Foster breathed slowly, a deliberate rhythm that spoke of training and a lifetime of controlling fear. Ben's bulky figure filled the space behind another rock. His square jaw and heavy brow gave him a naturally stern appearance, but his gray eyes were alert and calculating. Years earlier, he had lost a partner during a corruption-masked accident, and that betrayal had forged in him an intolerance for injustice, especially when powerful men tried to bury their crimes. A few feet away, Laura Kim kept her back pressed to a tree trunk. Her slim frame was tense but steady, her black hair tied tightly behind her head. Laura's sharp brown eyes swept the scene with methodical precision. She had always been unnervingly calm in dangerous environments, a survival skill learned from years of being dismissed and underestimated. Tonight, that calmness was their advantage. Olivia Clark hovered near Ethan, bundled in Ethan's oversized gray sweatshirt beneath her police jacket. Her hazel eyes reflected the pale moonlight as she pressed a hand over her healing ribs. Though the bruises along her jaw had darkened with the cold, her expression held a fire that had not dimmed since the moment she woke in Ethan's cabin. She pointed toward the riverbank. There, she whispered. That's the platform they used. On the concrete edge of the dam, a group of 5 men worked in mechanical silence. They were dressed in thick black coats and knit hats pulled low to obscure their faces. Their movements were efficient, almost practiced. 2 men lifted a cylindrical metal barrel from the back of a snow-dusted truck, muscles straining as they maneuvered it toward the water's edge. Another man stood near a small motorboat moored close to shore, checking the rope knots and the engine with impatience. And then he appeared. Richard Cole, owner of North River Chemical, stepped from the shadows with a quiet authority that made the other men shift nervously. Cole was in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair combed neatly back. His black wool coat and dark scarf looked crisp despite the weather, and his leather gloves shone dully under the moonlight. A faint cologne drifted from him, an expensive, clean scent that clashed with the filth of the crime unfolding behind him. His face bore the cold confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. His pale green eyes scanned the barrels with detached interest, as though inspecting imported wine rather than poison. "Hurry," Cole ordered, his voice smooth and cultured. "We finish before dawn. No mistakes." The tension thickened. Ethan tightened his grip on Max's fur. The plan was to gather evidence first, then move only when they had Cole fully exposed. But the moment stretched razor-thin. One wrong sound, one misplaced step, and everything would collapse. Max sensed it before any human did. His ears lifted, his muscles bunched, and a low growl vibrated through his chest. Ethan shot a warning glance at him, but the shepherd's instincts surged beyond command. In a single explosive motion, Max darted from behind the rock, his paws carving arcs through the snow. He sprinted straight toward the moored boat, leaping across patches of slick ice. Ethan lunged forward too late. Max's jaws clamped onto the thick rope securing the boat, and with a violent twist of his powerful neck, the rope snapped. The motorboat lurched, scraped against the dock, then drifted rapidly into the icy current. Chaos erupted. "What the hell?" one of Cole's men shouted. "Get that dog!" yelled another. Ethan burst from cover, followed closely by Ben, whose heavy boots pounded through the snow with the force of a charging bull. Olivia and Laura lifted their pistols, covering the field with crisp precision. "Police!" Olivia's voice carried over the storm, sharp and commanding. The men scattered. One swung a metal rod at Ethan, but Ethan dodged and slammed his shoulder into the attacker, knocking him flat. Ben grabbed another by the collar, dragging him backward so hard the man's feet left the ground. Max weaved between them, snarling at anyone who attempted to reach the fleeing boat. Richard Cole froze, shock breaking his polished exterior. He clutched a thick folder, evidence he planned to destroy. His eyes darted toward the river, calculating escape. "No, you don't," Laura snapped. Cole pivoted to toss the folder into the water. At that exact moment, Max launched forward, faster than thought, faster than fear, his paws hitting the ground in a blur. He snapped onto Cole's arm, forcing the folder to fly from his grip. The documents splattered into a shallow snow puddle, the ink beginning to blur, but still legible. "Drop your weapon and get on your knees." Sheriff Harris appeared behind Olivia, his hands trembling, but his voice steady. "Richard Cole, you're under arrest." For a moment, time hung suspended. Snowflakes drifted like soft white ash. The river groaned beneath its icy shell. The guilty barrels waited silently beside the stolen piece of Boise, and then the metallic click of handcuffs cut through the night. Richard Cole, once untouchable, knelt beneath the falling snow as Harris secured his wrists. The barrels, the evidence, the faces of the frightened workers, all stood as silent witnesses. Boise River had kept their secrets long enough. Tonight, under the winter moon, justice finally broke through the ice. Snow still blanketed Boise weeks after Richard Cole's arrest, but the city carried a different kind of cold now, one cleansed, not poisoned. The Boise River, once bruised by chemicals, shimmered with a new clarity that felt symbolic, as though the water itself had taken a long breath after months of being strangled. Investigators from the State Environmental Division had come and gone, each confirming what Ethan, Olivia, and the Winter Squad already knew. North River Chemical had been killing the river slowly, methodically, and without remorse. Now, with barrels seized, documents salvaged, and Cole's men confessing in waves, the case stood unshakably firm. Life in Boise moved forward. People filled their days with a little more ease, a little more warmth in their smiles, as if hope had thawed beneath the snow. And tonight, that hope took form in the Boise Winter Lights Festival, an annual gathering that felt more like a celebration of the city's survival than a seasonal event. The riverbank was transformed into a glowing corridor of color. Lanterns of red, amber, and sapphire swung gently from the bare branches of maple and cedar trees. Strings of white lights draped between lampposts, casting a soft golden shimmer across the newly restored river. Children ran laughing through the paths, bundled in puffy coats and wool hats with pom-poms bouncing behind them. Couples warmed their hands over small fire pits set up by vendors, where the scents of cinnamon cider, roasted nuts, and grilled sausages blended with the crisp winter air. Ethan Walker walked into the heart of the festival, feeling oddly out of place. His green coat tugged shut against the cold. His rugged face remained as weathered as ever, but there was a difference in his posture. Less guarded, less weighed down. He still kept his hands shoved in his pockets, a small shield against the attention he never liked. But there was a quiet ease in his step that hadn't existed weeks before. But tonight, someone else drew all the attention. Max. The 7-year-old German shepherd moved through the crowd with the dignity of a seasoned hero and the enthusiasm of a puppy. His black and tan coat glowed under the lantern lights, and his new collar, thick brown leather with a polished silver plate engraved Max, River Guardian, gleamed proudly on his neck. Children trailed behind him like loyal ducklings. One little girl, no more than 6, and wrapped in a bright purple jacket, kept trying to braid the fur behind his ears. Max tolerated it with saint-like patience, occasionally giving her cheek a polite, whiskery nudge. Ethan couldn't help but smile at the sight. Max, who once guarded Ethan from the world, now embraced it openly, tail swishing with a rhythm that seemed to set the tone for the entire festival. On the small wooden stage set near the river, Sheriff Mark Harris stepped to the microphone. He'd cleaned up better than expected, wearing a freshly pressed uniform and a hat that looked slightly too large for his head. His round face shone with pride, though he wiped his palms nervously on his pants before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice amplified over the hum of the crowd. "This winter, we learned that heroes don't always wear badges or uniforms. Sometimes they wear old coats, carry heavy pasts, or walk on 4 paws." A ripple of warm laughter moved through the audience. Harris continued, "For her bravery, persistence, and refusal to be silenced, we honor Officer Olivia Clark." Olivia stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause. She wore a simple cream sweater under her jacket, her dark hair falling in soft waves tonight instead of the tangled frieze of the river. The bruises had faded to thin golden marks along her jaw, barely visible now. Her hazel eyes shone, not just with recovered strength, but with a quiet pride she no longer tried to hide. She gave the crowd a humble smile, her cheeks flush from the cold and the emotion. "And for stepping out of the shadows when the city needed him most," Harris continued, "we honor Ethan Walker." Ethan blinked, visibly uncomfortable but touched. He gave a small nod, lifting a hand in an awkward half-wave while keeping the other deep in his coat pocket. The crowd clapped louder, moved by the man who had saved their river without ever asking for thanks. "And finally," Harris said, voice softening, "to the guardian who started it all, Max." The explosion of cheers was instant. Max jumped onto the stage with a proud bark that echoed across the water, causing more cheers and a few delightful shrieks from the children. Ethan laughed under his breath, something rare, something new, and shook his head at Max's natural flair for the spotlight. Later, when the crowd thinned and music shifted to a soft, slow melody, Ethan and Olivia stood together at the wooden railing overlooking the river. Snow drifted around them in gentle flurries, catching the festival lights and turning the night into a world of floating gold. Olivia leaned slightly closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought this river would be my grave, but it ended up bringing me to safety, to you, to all of this." Ethan watched Max chasing children through the snow, then looked at the families laughing together, the glow of lanterns mirrored in the water, the peace spreading across faces that had once been anxious and afraid. "I thought my purpose ended years ago," he murmured. "Turns out God just reassigned me." Olivia smiled softly. Ethan reached for her hand, not sudden, not bold, but gentle and certain. She intertwined her fingers with his. On that cold Boise night, beneath a sky full of drifting snow, a veteran, a rescued officer, and a loyal shepherd stood together, not as survivors of a crime, but as protectors of a town reborn. They had saved more than a river. They had revived hope. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or angels in the clouds. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of a reclusive veteran who refuses to walk away, a young officer who still believes in justice, or a loyal German shepherd who never hesitates to leap into danger. And sometimes, God sends exactly the guardian we need, at the exact moment our strength begins to fade. Life can feel like a cold river at times, pulling us toward places we fear we won't survive. But stories like this remind us that even in our darkest moments, hope can break through the ice. A helping hand can appear out of nowhere. A stranger can become a protector. And God can use ordinary people to perform extraordinary acts. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that goodness still walks this world, then share it with someone who might need a little light today. Leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what miracle you're praying for, or simply type, Amen. And if you believe that God still places guardians in our lives, hit subscribe and join us for more stories of faith, hope, courage, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, guide your steps, and send you a miracle exactly when you need it most. Amen.